Summer 1944. Deep in the battlefields of Western Europe, a German reconnaissance officer peers through high-powered binoculars across a foggy French river valley. What he sees makes his blood run cold. An entire American armored division, dozens upon dozens of heavy Sherman tanks, rows of military supply trucks, and hundreds of soldiers actively digging in, preparing for a massive, crushing assault. The German commander immediately radios high command, frantically redirecting thousands of veteran troops, heavy artillery batteries, and elite panzer units to reinforce that exact riverbank and block the incoming invasion force. What the German army didn't know, and what they would never find out until decades after the war was over, was that the massive threat in that valley was completely fake. The heavy Sherman tanks weighing 30 tons on paper were actually made of hollow rubber and inflated with air compressors. The roaring rumble of heavy tank engines echoing across the hills was coming from giant, high-power loudspeakers mounted on the back of armored trucks. The frantic radio transmissions flying across enemy airwaves were scripted plays performed by actors, and the soldiers wearing division patches in the fog weren't hardened combat infantrymen. They were art students, painters, sculptors, and sound engineers, recruited from the top art schools in New York and Paris. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known to military history as the Ghost Army, a top-secret unit of just 1,100 men whose ultimate weapon was not bullets, artillery, or atomic bombs, but absolute, perfect illusion. For nearly a year following D-Day, this handful of creative geniuses would stage over 20 large-scale fake battles right on the front lines of World War II, putting themselves directly in the crosshairs of the German war machine. Armed with nothing more than air, rubber, sound trucks, and pure theatrical nerve, they fooled the highest ranks of the Nazi high command, diverted entire enemy divisions away from real Allied troops, and saved an estimated tens of thousands of American lives without ever firing a single shot in anger. This is the untold story of the ultimate military deception and the secret army of artists who used their imagination to outsmart Adolf Hitler. The concept of the Ghost Army was born out of a desperate need during the Allied invasion of Normandy. As hundreds of thousands of American, British, and Canadian troops pushed inland into occupied France, Allied commanders faced a recurring, dangerous problem. Whenever a real division moved to attack or reinforce a position, they left behind massive gaps in the battle line. If the Germans discovered these empty gaps, they could launch a rapid counterattack and cut the Allied army in half. The U.S. Army needed a way to make enemy commanders believe that soldiers were standing guard where there was actually nobody at all. To build a unit capable of pulling off such a massive lie, the U.S. military didn't look to West Point or infantry training camps. Instead, talent scouts were sent to art institutions like Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the university art departments across America. They recruited young painters, illustrators, architects, sound designers, and advertising executives, men whose daily life revolved around visual storytelling, light, shadow, and human psychology. Among these young men were future icons like global fashion designer Bill Blass, world-renowned minimalist painter Ellsworth Kelly, and celebrated photographer Art Kane. They were brought to a secret military base in Tennessee and told they were joining a specialized tactical force, but few had any idea what was actually expected of them until they arrived. When the unit reached the European battlefield shortly after the D-Day landings in June 1944, their operation was split into three distinct arms of deception: visual, sonic, and radio. The visual deception was the most striking. The unit was equipped with hundreds of dummy tanks, trucks, artillery guns, and airplanes made of heavy-duty rubber and canvas. Using air compressors powered by small generators, a four-man crew could inflate a full-sized, 40-foot Sherman tank in less than 20 minutes. From a distance, or from the cockpit of a German reconnaissance aircraft flying high overhead, the rubber decoys were virtually indistinguishable from real iron war machines. However, the artists in the Ghost Army knew that an inflatable tank was only as believable as the details surrounding it. Real tanks weighed 30 tons and left deep, churned-up tracks in the mud. Rubber tanks left nothing, so members of the Ghost Army drove actual bulldozers and heavy tractors through the field to carve fake caterpillar tracks into the earth, leading directly to the rubber decoys. They constructed fake engine repair stations, hung laundry out to dry near wooden mess halls, and camouflaged their inflatable tanks just poorly enough so that German aerial photography scouts would spot them and believe they had uncovered a hidden American armor camp. The second layer of the deception was sonic warfare, managed by the 3132 Signal Service Company within the Ghost Army. Armed with state-of-the-art wire recorders, developed by Bell Labs, sound engineers went to armored training grounds in Fort Knox, recording every conceivable sound of an army on the move. The clanking of tank treads, the yelling of infantry sergeants, the idling of heavy diesel engines, and the hammering of maintenance crews. These individual audio clips were then mixed together on multi-track soundboards like a theatrical sound effect track. On the battlefield, the Ghost Army deployed massive, powerful loudspeakers mounted inside armored half-tracks. These custom-built speakers could blast recorded sounds over 15 miles across open countryside in the dead of night. By carefully angling the speakers and adjusting the volume, they could convince enemy listening posts that an entire armored division was creeping through the woods right toward their positions, inducing sheer panic among German commanders in the dark. The final piece of the puzzle was spoof radio operator trickery. The radio operators of the Ghost Army studied the distinct Morse code styles, known as a operator's fist, of real military units. They would then mimic those exact rhythmic patterns over unencrypted radio frequencies, sending fake battle plans, supply requests, and troop movements that they knew Nazi intelligence officers were actively intercepting and translating. To make the illusion absolute, soldiers from the Ghost Army took part in what they called atmosphere operations. Small groups of men would wear the division's shoulder patches of real, famous military units, such as the 90th Infantry or the 6th Armored Division, and drive around in trucks with fake division markings painted on the doors. They would deliberately walk into local French cafes and bars in towns where enemy spies and Nazi sympathizers were known to operate, dropping casual, carefully rehearsed rumors about where their massive army was planning to strike next. The Ghost Army's greatest and most dangerous performance came in late March 1945, during Operation Viersen. The U.S. Ninth Army was preparing for one of the most critical moves of the entire war, crossing the massive Rhine River into the heartland of Germany itself. If the Germans held the riverbank, thousands of American soldiers would be slaughtered in the water. The Ghost Army was ordered to draw the German reserves away from the actual crossing point, setting up operations near the towns of Viersen and Anrath. 1,100 artists set out to pretend they were two entire infantry divisions, a massive force of over 30,000 men. For several days and nights, working under constant threat of enemy artillery fire, the Ghost Army inflated hundreds of fake tanks and cannons, played high-power recordings of troop deployments through the night, and flooded the airwaves with fake radio chatter. They constructed fake headquarters buildings and set up large, active supply dumps along the river. The trick worked with terrifying perfection. German high command bought the illusion completely. Believing the main Allied attack was coming directly at Viersen, the German commanders pulled their heavy infantry and artillery units away from the actual U.S. Ninth Army crossing site and locked them into position opposite the rubber tanks. When the real U.S. Ninth Army launched their river crossing miles away, they met almost no resistance, establishing a critical bridgehead into Germany with minimal casualties. Major General William H. Simpson of the Ninth Army later remarked that the brilliant trickery of the Ghost Army had undoubtedly saved thousands of his men's lives during that single operation. Yet, despite their extraordinary bravery and the staggering number of lives they saved, the men of the Ghost Army walked away from the war in complete silence. Because their tactics were so effective and unique, the U.S. military classified the entire history of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops as top secret immediately after the Nazi surrender in 1945. The soldiers were instructed to sign non-disclosure agreements, ordered never to speak to the press, and forbidden from telling even their wives and children what they had actually done during the war. For over 50 years, when people asked these veteran artists what they did in World War II, they could only give vague answers about camouflage design or administrative clerk work. It was not until 1996, more than half a century after the guns fell silent, that the US government finally declassified the official files of the Ghost Army. The world finally learned that a small group of 1,100 painters, actors, and engineers had stood on the front lines of World War II with no heavy weapons to protect them, using nothing but rubber, sound waves, and unyielding courage to outsmart the military machine of the Third Reich. In March 2024, the surviving members of the unit were officially awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States, finally receiving the public recognition they had earned so many decades before. What makes the story of the Ghost Army so remarkable isn't just the sheer cleverness of their inflatable tanks or sound trucks. It's the profound triumph of human creativity over brute destructive power. In a war defined by iron, blood, and devastation, these 1,100 men proved that the intellect of an artist could be just as decisive on the battlefield as a heavy artillery battery. They didn't win their war by taking lives, but by creating a grand masterpiece of deception, standing unarmed in front of the enemy, armed with nothing more than an extraordinary imagination, and saving thousands of lives in the process.